We've been wrong about pirates, not about the ships, not about the flags, about the enemy. We imagine them falling in battle, cannons roaring, swords drawn, the Royal Navy closing in on all sides. We picture heroic last stands on blood-soaked decks, commanders going down with their ships. But that's not how most of them died. Most of them died quietly, below deck, in the dark, curled against the hull, listening to the water on the other side of 4 inches of wood, with no one watching, and with no one writing it down. Their real enemy had no face, no flag, no name on any wanted poster nailed to a port wall. It didn't fire a single shot. It was the sea itself, and everything it refused to give them. This is the story of what pirates actually ate, what they drank, what rotted around them and inside them, and how the daily, brutal management of hunger and thirst was perhaps the most dangerous game they ever played. More dangerous than any navy, more dangerous than any storm. Because you can see a storm coming. Before any pirate ship left port, before any merchant vessel was spotted on the horizon, before any flag was raised, the most critical decision had already been made. How much food could they carry? A ship like the Ranger or the Queen Anne's Revenge might carry 60, 80, sometimes over 100 men, each one needing roughly 3,000 calories a day just to survive the physical demands of working a sailing vessel, climbing rigging in 90-degree heat, hauling lines, pumping bilge water for hours at a stretch. The math was brutal and left almost no room for error. Salt pork, salt beef, hard biscuit, called hardtack, dried peas, oats when they were lucky, rum, and water. Always, always the question of water. Salted meat was packed into wooden barrels with enough brine to strip the color from your hands after a few minutes of contact. The smell of the hold, that dark, a low space below the gun deck, was something men described as a living thing. Wet leather left in the sun for a week, layered over iron, over rot, over the faint sweetness of old rum soaking into the grain of the wood. That smell never left the ship. It lived in the planks. It lived in your clothes. A sailor in the 1690s wrote in his journal, "The beef was so hard, a man could scarce drive a nail through it." That was considered good beef. But here's what most people don't realize. This system of salting and barreling wasn't primitive desperation. It was engineering, refined over decades, passed down between sailors the way a craftsman passes down a technique. Without it, a ship couldn't stay at sea for more than 2 weeks before the food became useless. With it, 6 months, sometimes more. And that range, those 6 months of operational range, was the entire foundation of pirate power in the Caribbean. It's what allowed them to disappear, to reappear where no one expected them, to outlast the ships sent to hunt them. The barrel wasn't glamorous, but the barrel was everything. If salt meat was the backbone of a pirate's diet, hardtack was the spine holding the whole skeleton together, made from just 2 ingredients, flour and water. No yeast, no salt, no fat, nothing that would invite life of any kind. Mixed into a stiff paste, pressed flat, and baked twice, sometimes 3 times, until every last molecule of moisture had been driven out. The result was a dense, pale disk of near-indestructible starch, roughly the size of a man's palm. It could last under dry conditions for years, in theory. In practice, the tropics had other plans. The weevils arrived first, usually within the first few weeks at sea. Small, reddish-brown beetles that bored through the hardtack's surface and laid their eggs deep inside the biscuit. Shows by month 2, every biscuit in every barrel was riddled with larvae. White, soft, curled things that moved when the biscuit warmed in your hand. The solution the men developed was remarkably matter-of-fact. Eat in the dark. Below deck, in lantern light so dim it was barely more than a faint glow, you couldn't see the movement. What you didn't see you didn't feel. What you didn't feel, you swallowed. Some men preferred tapping the biscuit hard against the edge of the table before eating, knocking as many weevils loose as possible before the first bite. Others soaked the hardtack in rum for 10 minutes or boiled it into a gray paste they called skilligalee, not because it tasted good, but because soft food didn't break teeth. Because, yes, that was a genuine medical concern. Hardtack sent more men to the ship's surgeon with cracked and broken teeth than most sword fights did. And a man with broken teeth on a 6-month voyage had a serious problem, because the next dentist was roughly 500 miles away. The weevils were disgusting. The broken teeth were painful. But they were the least of the problems waiting for these men, because something far more dangerous had already begun, silently, invisibly, in the blood of every man aboard. On land, you don't think about water. You think about it the way you think about the floor beneath your feet. It's simply there. On a ship in the open Caribbean, water is the only thing you think about. It is the axis around which every other decision rotates. A crew of 80 men needed roughly 80 gallons of drinking water per day, and that's the bare minimum before you account for cooking, before you account for the swelling heat of a Caribbean summer that pushed men to sweat through their clothes before noon. Fresh water was stored in large wooden casks, oak mostly, sealed with wax and tar. The problem was the wood itself. Wood breathes. Microscopic gaps in the grain that no amount of tar could fully seal. In the damp, warm air of the ship's hold, algae took hold within days. Bacteria followed. By week 3, the water had turned cloudy. By week 5, it was the color of weak tea and smelled like a stagnant pond on a hot afternoon. By week 6, if it lasted that long, it smelled like something had died in it. Men drank it anyway, holding their breath before swallowing, cutting it with rum when the ration allowed, because the alcohol killed enough of what was living in it to make it marginally safer. This is, in fact, one of the real reasons rum was so central to the sailors' diet, not just morale. Diluted rum, called grog, was genuinely safer to drink than the water it was mixed with. Pirates developed strict rationing systems to make the water last. These rules weren't informal. They were written into the ship's articles, the formal contract that every crew member signed before the ship left port. And each man received a specific daily allowance, measured, recorded, non-negotiable. And critically, it was the quartermaster, not the captain, who controlled the supply. The quartermaster was elected by the crew. He answered to them, not to the captain, which meant the captain could not weaponize thirst, could not deny water to men he wanted to punish or control. It was, in its own strange way, a democratic safeguard against tyranny. When the water ran low, and it always ran low, the entire character of the voyage changed. Every extra mile became a gamble. Every delay became a calculation of what it was costing them in water. A pirate ship racing toward a known freshwater source wasn't hunting treasure in those final miles. It was running from a clock that had almost reached zero. Here's what 6 months of hardtack and salt pork actually does to a human body. Not the theory, the physical reality, step by step. By month 2, the sodium accumulating in a sailor's tissues begins to create pressure in the joints. Fingers stiffen in the morning, ankles swell by afternoon. The skin across the knuckles tightens until it feels like the bones are trying to push through. By month 3, the absence of vitamin C, found almost nowhere in the preserved diet aboard ship, begins to unravel the body's ability to maintain connective tissue. The collagen that holds everything together starts to break down. This is scurvy, and it is one of the most disturbing diseases in the historical record because of the particular cruelty of one of its symptoms. Old wounds healed years ago, sword cuts, burns, childhood fractures, reopen. The scar tissue dissolves. Injuries a man had forgotten about for a decade return as if they happened yesterday. It starts with the gums. They soften, then bleed when you chew. Then the teeth loosen. Then the fatigue becomes something total and crushing. Not tiredness, but a heaviness in the very bones. A ship's surgeon in 1707 described it plainly. The men's legs turned black and swollen to the size of small barrels. They smelled of rot while still alive. Scurvy killed more sailors during the age of sail than battle, storms, and shipwreck combined. Pirates knew this. They watched it happen on every long voyage. They didn't know why. The science of vitamins wouldn't exist for another 2 centuries. But they learned through brutal trial and error. On what stopped it: citrus fruit, raw onions, fresh turtle meat when they could catch sea turtles from the deck, even certain types of bark and leaf traded from coastal communities. Raids on merchant vessels weren't always about gold or cloth or navigational instruments. Sometimes a crew boarded a Spanish supply ship and came back carrying limes with the same urgency other men reserved for silver. A crate of Seville oranges seized from a merchant vessel wasn't a luxury. It was a medical intervention. It was the difference between a crew that could fight in 2 weeks and a crew that couldn't stand. The pirates who understood this, who planned for it, who raided specifically to address it, were the ones who stayed operational. The ones who dismissed it as weakness didn't last long enough to become legends. Between voyages, the majority of Caribbean pirates converged on one place: Nassau, New Providence Island, the Bahamas. From roughly 1706 to 1718, it was the closest thing the Golden Age of Piracy had to a capital. A lawless, sun-hammered settlement of perhaps 1,000 men at its peak, built on a natural harbor deep enough for large ships and positioned close enough to the major Atlantic trade lanes to be strategically invaluable. Here, the food situation inverted almost completely. Sea turtles were so abundant they could be caught from the beach. Fish of every kind. Fruit, mangoes, plantains, coconuts, within walking distance of the harbor. Fresh water from inland springs that ran clean and cold even in the height of summer. Men who had spent 4 months surviving on weevil-ridden biscuit and salt meat that smelled like old iron arrived in Nassau and simply ate. Enormously, constantly, with a desperation that anyone who has ever been truly hungry for an extended time would recognize immediately. But Nassau wasn't only a refuge, it was a supply infrastructure. Ships were careened on the beach, rolled onto their sides so their hulls could be scraped clean of barnacles and marine growth that slowed them and rotted the wood from beneath. Fresh provisions were loaded, barrels were refilled, rotten cordage replaced. The economics of piracy, stripped of all romance, were fundamentally the economics of feeding and maintaining a vessel. A captain who could not provision his ship could not recruit a crew. A captain who could not keep his crew fed and watered on a long voyage would not have a crew by the end of it. The men signed the articles. They agreed to the codes of conduct. They followed the ship. But the unspoken contract beneath all of it was simple. Keep us alive and we will follow you anywhere. Break that contract and the consequences were swift. The hunger-driven mutinies. The desperate votes below deck when the water was gone and the captain was still promising landfall in 3 more days. The moment when a crew decided collectively that the man giving the orders was no longer worth following. Those moments are where the real drama of the Golden Age of Piracy lives. Not on the gun deck, in the hold. We remember pirates for their flags, for Blackbeard's burning fuses, for Bartholomew Roberts in his red waistcoat, for the myth, outsized, romantic, built over centuries of comfortable distance from the actual smell of the thing. But the truth is quieter, stranger, and in some ways more impressive than any legend. Their real mastery wasn't the cannon or the cutlass, it was the barrel, the biscuit, the carefully measured half-cup of green water handed out at dawn by a quartermaster who knew exactly how many days were left before they'd all be dying of thirst. The Golden Age of Piracy was, at its core, in a sustained feat of survival engineering, built on the daily, unglamorous, largely undocumented labor of keeping human bodies functional in one of the most hostile environments in human history. Every raid they launched, every trade lane they controlled, every navy they embarrassed, it was only possible because somewhere below deck, in the dark and the heat and the smell, someone had packed enough salt pork to last another month. And someone else had remembered the limes. That's the pirate story history forgot to tell. What do you want us to explore next? The diseases that tore through crews like fire in a wooden ship? The punishment codes they wrote for themselves, brutal, specific, and stranger than anything a navy ever devised? Or the storms that didn't just damage ships, but ended entire fleets in a single night and were never spoken of again? Leave it in the comments. This voyage isn't over.